Thank you for coming. Good afternoon, I think, gentlemen of the press. The Abuja School of Social and Political Thought have to invite you to this urgent press conference because of the extreme importance and urgency of reacting to the event that happened yesterday's evening regarding the ongoing crisis in the River State government. As you may know, or as you know, Mr. President of the Republic of Nigeria yesterday night dissolved democratic structures in all River States, including the governor, the deputy governor, and the House of Assembly, in the language of suspending them for 6 months. The Abuja School feels compelled to react to this development because it holds very extreme danger to democracy and good governance in Nigeria. First, the facts are obvious that since the 2023 governorship election in River State, there has been crisis between the executive and the legislature. This crisis, as destabilizing as it is, and as distracting as it is to good governance, has not created a situation of breakdown of law and order. And therefore, this avoidable crisis and conflict between the executive and the legislature of River State is amenable to resolution by other political means, including reconciliation, judicial determination, which the Supreme Court has done, and arbitration. So Abuja School stand with Mr. President in condemning this crisis and conflict. But Abuja School takes a view that the solution Mr. President has proposed is worse than the sickness itself. First, the Constitution authorizes Mr. President to declare a state of emergency in very limited circumstances, namely when the federation is at war, defined as a military combat or conflict with another country. 2, when a part of the country, the federation or a part of it, is there's actual breakdown of law and order. 3, when there's strong belief that of the actual the possibility or actual of the view that there is an imminent breakdown of law and order. And 4, of course, when the governor and the House of Assembly, by a resolution, invites Mr. President to declare a state of emergency in those parts. The whole of Section 305 nowhere anticipates that a state of emergency declaration would mean a dissolution of democratic structure, not nowhere at all. The history and the background of this section is important. In the 1960s, the First Republic, we didn't have equivalent of this section. And we had an emergency law that authorizes the Prime Minister to dissolve government in the region. And that was what led to the dissolution in Western Nigeria. But since 1979 till date, the Constitution has stipulated what a state of emergency means. Furthermore, reading section 305 sub 4 tells clearly that in a state of emergency, the governor and the House will still remain. The idea of a state of emergency is for Mr. President to take extraordinary measures to address the extent of the threat that is extraordinary. And so, President Jonathan invoked this section to address the challenges of insecurity arising after the 2011 election, where some local governments in 3 states in Nigeria were basically taken over by terrorists and other forms of violent criminals. In Jonathan's declaration of state of emergency, it was very clear. Border was closed, limited movement around those areas, but nowhere was the local government checked. In fact, there were clamor that those local government taken over completely should be dissolved. But President Jonathan wisely and in correct reading of the Constitution did not do any of this, because the measures taken were enough to contain the crisis or the actual or perceived breakdown of land order. It's important also to note that the basis of the federation under the Constitution is that there are 3 levels of power, and the Supreme Court recently reinforced this notion that each level of power cannot be abrogated. Each level of democratic governance can never be abrogated. That's why the Supreme Court says you cannot dissolve local government democracy. In same vein, Section 1(3) of the Constitution makes clear Nigeria cannot be governed except in accordance with democratic system under this law. So, in constitutional law, what Mr. President has done violates clearly the Constitution. It has abrogated a democratic structure in the state. It has violated and denied the people of Rivers State the right to choose their leaders, and imposed a sole administrator. Sole administrator is what the Supreme Court frowned with local government. States governors cannot impose sole administrators. The federal government cannot impose sole administrators. Now, the history of this constitutional violation, very obvious one, is President Obasanjo's proclamation in Ekiti State. But it's dangerous that constitutional violations become precedents and repeated. What President Tinubu has done is an affront on democracy, on constitutional governance. Now let's take the facts. The president in his speech made 3 clear points. 1, that there's a crisis of conflict between the state executive, the governor, and the House. 2, that he has arbitrated and tried to resolve it, giving them a 10-point roadmap. 3, that the Supreme Court of Nigeria has exhaustively dealt with the crisis and settled it on a pronouncement that the governor should present the budget to the House. Now, what remained was, until yesterday, the convenience of the governor and the House meeting to finally agree on this process. This is a political conflict that does not in any way amount to a breakdown of law and order or war in Nigeria or any part thereof. The 3rd or 4th point the president made very clear is that there has been recent attack on pipeline, and he said, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, he had directed action. So everything needed to deal with the spate or possibility of attack on oil installation can be managed by Mr. President exercise of commander-in-chief power, which he claimed he has started doing. So there was no conflict, no crisis, no breakdown requiring a state of emergency of the nature, first, of even declaring war, 2, of abrogating democratic structure. So Mr. President's speech shows clearly that he is on top of the crisis. He said, I have directed military response to protect infrastructure. Wherein is the breakdown of land order? Yesterday I was in River State, Port Harcourt. I just finished this morning. I went to deliver a lecture at a major event. There was peaceful movement. There was nothing. So this is a contrived emergency to capture state power. That's what it is. is dangerous for the country, because it means that if there's a conflict that has bad political outcome for Mr. President or his party, he could dissolve government and appoint a sole administrator in order to gain political advantage. The Abuja school will call on Mr. President to err is human, to correct it is human. The president has erred grievously, should rescind that proclamation in line with the Constitution. 2, the Abuja school calls on the National Assembly to exercise its power to disapprove Mr. President's wrongful, unconstitutional, and self-serving declaration of state of emergency. We like the president to work together with the House. It's good that they have good working relationship. But this is one of those instances where the two houses of the National Assembly has a responsibility to second guess the president. 3, if the National Assembly does not disapprove this declaration, we call upon individuals of Rivers State to go to the court to challenge Mr. President's wrongful exercise of power. Now, let's be very clear about this. This is not about Mr. President, this is not about Fubara, this is not about the House. Again, many commentators, I want to thank the Nigerian Bar Association for being very upfront and courageous in this, but people miss out the point. The real issue is not dissolving the governor. In fact, the most heinous crime is dissolving the House of Assembly. The legislature is the heart and the essence of democracy. The people's legislative representatives, the President of Nigeria cannot dissolve a state House of Assembly. Cannot. And that's what the Constitution says. In any moment there's a big crisis in the state of Assembly, the National Assembly, which is a representative of the same Nigerian people, can make law for the time being, where there's an impasse. There is nothing in the Constitution of Nigeria that entertains the possibility that the governor elected by the people can be removed except by impeachment by the people's representative for misconduct, except by recall. There's no other way to remove the governor. Again, all actions required, even in times of war, the Constitution anticipates, even in times of war, the president will still leave the governorship, the democratic structures, and invoke war powers to address. That's why he's a commander-in-chief. For example, in Rivers State, Mr. President can impose a curfew. The president can restrict movement into oil facilities. The president, like they did yesterday, they have moved in tanks to Rivers State. There are many things that the president has the powers to do if there is actual breakdown of law and order. So there are 3 points here. 1, there is no actual breakdown of law and order as the Constitution anticipates. A political logjam, political conflict is not breakdown of law and order, because every political conflict has a mode of resolution within the Constitution. And by the way, the Supreme Court decision has actually provided a template. What remains now is for either the House to meet to receive the appropriation, or even if they want to impeach the governor, it's still a political solution. So what the president did is contrived, meaning it does not have any factual basis. 2, is self-serving and overreaching. He has implanted his administrator over a state that is critical for the run-up to 2037, and therefore he has taken away the power of the people to determine their fate and given it to a sole administrator who is answerable to himself. This is the essence of tyranny, and I would be surprised and sorely displeased if National Assembly does not nullify and cancel this false and unconstitutional proclamation of state of emergency. And finally, it's important as we run up to 2027. We know that politicians on the left and the right are all desperate for power. That's the nature of politics. Everyone's going to look for what gives them advantage. But it's important that Abuja School wants to caution that the steps towards anarchy and breakdown of law and order is usually gradual. We saw it in 1967. 1967, the Civil War. People, all of us regret the Biafra War. But the war was not decreed from heaven. The war came out of series of desperate political actions, starting from Western Nigeria, starting from the coup, starting from failure to go to transition of succession, starting from different incompatibilities. And we don't want Nigeria to go through this way. Anyone who reads history, look at Guinea, look at Mali. Everything about this conflict in Rivers State is a fallout of election. Outcomes of election, betrayers, and politicians don't want to live with suboptimal results. Politicians want to have maximum outcome, and that's why we're in this trouble. And now, Mr. President, political strategies has pushed the conflict higher by taking advantage of a crisis to create a political outcome for himself. So Abuja Squad put on record that this should be marked in our history as a very clear-eyed violation of constitutional law by Mr. President because of political advantage. There is no actual or possible breakdown of law and order in Rivers State as of today that justifies a state of emergency. And even if a state of emergency is declared, it has nothing to do with abrogating the National House of Assembly or dissolving, suspending the governor. Those actions are fortuitous, extreme, and do not logically flow from the facts of the crisis in Rivers State. So we want to enjoy the National Assembly, do the right thing, not disapprove Mr. President's declaration of emergency. We want to call upon the government of Rivers State, the governor and his team, to go to court and challenge this because Obasanjo did it wrongfully and it passed. Jonathan wisely did not do it. Jonathan declared emergency in 3 states, closed down borders, curfew, restrictions, moved in the National Guard, National Army. That's what the emergency is. Emergency does not mean, I want to put on record as a lawyer, constitutional lawyer, there is no in this, the Constitution does not entertain at all that any state of emergency will require dissolving governor. The Constitution is clear. Nigeria cannot in or any part govern except through a democratic means. You can declare all emergency. In fact, at war, we cannot. That's why the Constitution says that if Nigeria is in war, the president's tenure can extend. You don't need to dissolve democracy to fight a war. And in Rivers, there is nothing close to an actual breakdown of land order. What we have is a political crisis that could be resolved, should be resolved through political process. And the Supreme Court has provided a determinative decision that the president would have. The president could have perhaps said he's going to take action to force the governor to comply. The president has a power, has a function of enforcing the constitution. If the president has said, based on what the Supreme Court has said, I am going to direct that the governor and the House should meet in the next 2 weeks to approve the appropriation bill, that would be within the powers of the president to protect the constitution. But to use that excuse to suspend the governor, the deputy, and the House is overreaching, is never anticipating the constitution, and is thoroughly and completely, outside the remit of the powers of Mr. President under Section 5 of the Constitution. Thank you very much.